Imagine buying a wife for 3 red blankets and a sack of beads. In the freezing Rockies of 1835, she wasn't a partner, she was a piece of equipment, scraping bloody hides until her hands cracked and keeping you alive when the snow hit. But for thousands of native women, the true horror wasn't the hard labor. It was the day the real white bride arrived from the east. In a single moment, the woman who saved the trapper's life was kicked into the dirt like a broken tool. But the tragedy didn't stop at eviction, because the traitor decided he would keep the children. Amidst the chaotic cacophony of the annual trapper gathering in the Green River Valley during the mid-1830s, a specific type of commerce was taking place that was far more consequential than the trading of beaver pelts for whiskey. While hundreds of mercantile deals were struck over barrels of gunpowder and bales of fur, one transaction stood out as the defining economic and social contract of the frontier, revealing the stark pragmatism of life in the wilderness. A young fur hunter, desperate to establish a foothold in these unforgiving lands, would approach the stoic elders of a local tribe to initiate a negotiation that was as cold as it was vital, treating the formation of a human bond with the same detached calculation as restocking his supplies for the coming winter. He would spread a buffalo robe on the hard ground and deliberately lay out a standard, unwritten price list for survival, items that held immense value in the indigenous economy of the era. The pile typically consisted of 5 pounds of premium tobacco, 3 heavy wool blankets dyed a bright scarlet, a reliable flintlock rifle, and a heavy sack of glass beads intended for decoration. These were not gifts of courtship but a formal payment, a transfer of wealth that signaled the trapper's ability to provide material goods and his seriousness about the contract he was about to enter. The elders would inspect the quality of the wool and the mechanism of the gun, weighing the offer against the value of the daughter they were about to relinquish to a man who lived in a world they only partially understood. In exchange for these manufactured goods, the trapper received neither land deeds nor horses, but a young woman who was expected to transition instantly from the protection of her father's wigwam to the strange, lonely tent of a white outsider. This transfer occurred without a single word of consent being asked of the bride, who stood by as a silent observer to the sale of her own future, moving from one owner to another like a piece of high-value livestock. This arrangement was known throughout the territories as marriage according to the custom of the country, a convenient euphemism that allowed white men to bypass the religious and legal structures of the civilization they had left behind while securing a partner for the hardships ahead. To the white mountain men, this union was rarely a pursuit of romance or the founding of a family in the traditional Victorian sense, but rather the acquisition of a critical survival tool that was as essential as his skinning knife or his steel traps. In the brutal, freezing isolation of the Rocky Mountains, where a solitary man was statistically doomed to a quick death by exposure, starvation, or accident, a native wife was a multifunctional asset that money could not buy in the cities of the East. She was viewed not as a soulmate, but as a necessary piece of equipment, a living mechanism that allowed the trapper to function in an environment that was actively trying to kill him every single day. She brought with her an ancestral encyclopedia of knowledge regarding the landscape, possessing the ability to find edible roots when the game herds migrated away and the skill to cure hides so they did not rot in the damp spring thaw. Her hands were calloused from labor that the white men did not know how to perform, from stitching waterproof moccasins that prevented frostbite to setting up a weather-tight camp in a blizzard with nothing but frozen branches and animal skins. Without her labor, the trapper's clothing would fall apart, his food stocks would spoil, and his camp would become a frozen tomb, making her presence the single most significant factor in his longevity and financial success. Beyond her domestic utility, she served as a living diplomatic passport, a translator who could bridge the linguistic and cultural chasm between the trapper and the indigenous populations that controlled the high country. She was the navigator who knew the ancient trails obscured by deep snow, but most importantly, she was the only guarantee that her tribe would not skin the trapper alive upon their first encounter in the deep woods. Her presence at the campfire signaled to approaching war parties that this white man was kin by marriage, a status that transformed him from an invader into a relative, providing a shield of immunity that was far more effective than any rifle he could carry. Over the course of the subsequent 10 years, it was the ceaseless, back-breaking industry of this nameless woman that effectively transmuted the raw, bloody reality of the wilderness into the refined gold that lined the bank vaults of St. Louis. While the mountainman spent his daylight hours wading through freezing streams to check his iron traps, his existence was defined by the singular pursuit of the beaver plew, but the acquisition of the animal was merely the first and easiest step in a complex manufacturing process. The true value of the fur was not dictated by the kill, but by the preservation, a gruesome and exhausting task that fell entirely upon the shoulders of the native wife who remained at the camp. Without her skilled hands to arrest the natural process of decay, the piles of skins would have rotted into a worthless, maggot-infested heap long before the rendezvous wagons arrived to transport them east, rendering the trapper's efforts futile and his financial dreams dead on the riverbank. Day after day, while her husband roamed the high country, the woman spent her hours bent double over a wooden fleshing beam, engaging in a labor so physically demanding that it frequently deformed the spines of those who performed it for a lifetime. She used a tool fashioned from the sharpened leg bone of an elk or a rough iron blade to scrape the tenacious layers of fat, muscle, and membrane from the underside of the hides, a process that required the strength of a stone mason and the precision of a surgeon. If she scraped too deep, she would cut the skin and ruin its market value. If she scraped too shallow, the remaining fat would turn rancid and destroy the fur. Her hands, constantly immersed in animal fluids and exposed to the biting wind, became cracked and stained, a living testament to the sheer physical cost of the fur trade that the buyers in London and Paris would never see nor comprehend when they stroked the felt of a finished hat. Once the hides were scraped clean of flesh, the woman began the chemical alchemy required to turn stiff, drying rawhide into the supple, durable leather known as buckskin, which was the fabric of survival on the frontier. Lacking the tannins and chemicals of European factories, she utilized the only resource available in the wild, the brains of the animal itself, which contained natural emulsifying agents capable of softening the collagen fibers. She would cook a gray, viscous soup of animal brains and water, rubbing this greasy mixture deep into the pores of the skin with her bare hands, often working for hours until the solution had fully penetrated the fiber network. This was a messy, foul-smelling operation that permeated her clothes and hair with the scent of the slaughter, a sensory reminder that the elegance of the final product was born from the visceral gore of the butchery floor. The final stage of this preservation required the woman to stretch the treated hides on frames of willow branches, pulling them taut until they sang like drums in the mountain breeze, and then smoking them over a smoldering fire of rottenwood or damp sage. The smoke cured the leather and waterproofed it, preventing it from stiffening after being soaked by rain or snow, a critical quality for garments worn in the unpredictable weather of the Rockies. She monitored the fire with an obsessive vigilance, ensuring the heat was constant but never intense enough to scorch the valuable merchandise. It was this specific, smoky aroma of the Indian tanned leather that became the signature scent of the mountain man, a smell that signified he was clothed and protected by the labor of a woman who understood the chemistry of nature better than any university-educated scientist in the civilized world. Beyond the production of commercial goods, the native wife served as the exclusive tailor and outfitter for the expedition, manufacturing the gear that stood between her husband and death by hypothermia. The wool and cotton clothing the trapper brought from the east would typically disintegrate within months under the strain of the briar patches and the rocky terrain, leaving him dependent on the garments she fashioned from the skins she had tanned. She sewed moccasins that allowed him to move silently through the forest, double-layered for winter warmth and stitched with sinew that swelled when wet to create a watertight seal. She crafted heavy buffalo robes and fringed hunting shirts that shed water and broke the biting wind, her needlework so tight and durable that a single set of clothes could survive years of abuse that would destroy factory-made textiles in weeks. Her role extended to that of the primary provider of sustenance during the lean months when the game migrated out of the high valleys and the trapper's rifle returned empty day after day. When the meat supplies dwindled, she turned to the ancient botanical knowledge of her people, scouring the hillsides for edible roots like the camas bulb and the bitterroot, which she harvested with a digging stick and roasted to unlock their nutritional value. She collected berries and dried them in the sun, pounding them together with dried meat and rendered fat to create pemmican, a high-calorie survival food that could last for years without spoiling. This dense, energy-rich brick was the fuel that kept the trapper alive during the long treks across the barren plains, a portable lifeline manufactured entirely by the foresight and industry of the woman waiting at the hearth. In the midst of this relentless cycle of labor, she bore the trapper's children, often delivering them in a solitude that would terrify a modern observer, far removed from the aid of midwives or doctors. When her time came, she would simply step away from the camp, finding a secluded spot in a thicket or by a stream, and bring new life into the world with a stoic silence ingrained by her culture. She would sever the umbilical cord with a sharp stone knife or her husband's skinning blade, wash the infant in the cold waters of a mountain creek, and wrap it in moss and rabbit skins before returning to her work. These children, the first generation of the Metis, were raised on her back in a cradleboard while she continued to scrape hides and dig roots, their cries mingling with the sounds of the camp as they grew up between the two colliding worlds of their parents. As the years passed and the trapper's wealth grew, he began to transition from a nomadic wanderer to a sedentary trader, establishing a permanent post that served as a commercial hub for the region. Here, the value of his wife shifted from that of a laborer to that of a diplomat, as her presence turned the fort into a sanctuary recognized by the indigenous powers of the territory. The wooden palisades and the brass cannons mounted on the walls offered less protection than the blood connection she shared with the local chiefs, who viewed the trading post not as a foreign incursion but as the home of a kinsman. Her family ties ensured that the trade routes remained open and that the trapper's horses were not stolen in the night, creating a bubble of political stability that allowed his business to flourish in the center of a war zone. The trapper, watching his stockpiles of fur grow and his credit expand in the ledgers of the Eastern trading companies, gradually came to view his success as the result of his own shrewdness and bravery. He built larger warehouses and smoked finer tobacco, accepting the comfort and security provided by his wife as one accepts the warmth of the sun, as a natural, inevitable phenomenon that required no gratitude. He did not see the hours of scraping, the bloody fingers, or the diplomatic whispers that saved his scalp. He saw only the finished product and the profit it generated. In his mind, she remained a piece of the landscape, a highly efficient biological machine that performed a necessary function, never realizing that every dollar in his pocket and every breath in his lungs was a gift from the woman who sat quietly in the corner, mending the seams of the life he claimed as his own. By the time the calendar turned to the middle of the 1840s, the vast, silent wilderness of the American West began to shudder under the weight of a profound geopolitical and social transformation that would forever alter the lives of those who had tamed it. The era of the mountain men, defined by the solitary pursuit of the beaver in icy streams, was rapidly collapsing, its economic foundation eroded by the whims of European fashion which had fickly turned from fur to silk. The streams that had once teemed with fur-bearers were now empty, trapped out by a generation of relentless exploitation, forcing the men who had once lived by the knife and the trap to reinvent themselves as stationary merchants, ferry operators, and ranchers. The lonely trails they had blazed through the mountain passes were no longer the domain of the mule train and the pack horse, but were being ground into deep ruts by the iron-rimmed wheels of heavy covered wagons, the vanguard of a massive migration that brought a new kind of conqueror to the frontier. Along the dusty, sun-baked ribbon of the Oregon Trail, a new demographic began to pour into the territories, differing radically from the rough-hewn bachelors who had arrived a decade earlier. These were not solitary adventurers seeking a temporary fortune, but families pushing westward with the intent of recreating the society they had left behind in the East, complete with its churches, its schools, and its rigid moral codes. They brought with them the heavy oak furniture of civilization, the King James Bible, and a strict Victorian worldview that had no place for the fluid, pragmatic cultural mixing that had defined the fur trade era. As these wagons rolled into the trading posts and nascent settlements, they brought a wave of judgment that crashed against the existing social order, redefining what was acceptable and what was an abomination in the eyes of their God and their government. The former trappers, men who had accumulated significant wealth and influence through their indigenous alliances, suddenly found themselves standing on the precipice of a new social hierarchy where their old assets were now liabilities. The Native American wives who had been the cornerstone of their success, the women whose diplomatic connections had allowed these trading posts to exist in the first place, were no longer viewed as valuable partners but as living evidence of a shameful past. The custom of the country, marriage, once a respected institution of the frontier, was sneered at by the new arrivals as a pagan arrangement, a sinful cohabitation that lacked the sanctity of the church and the legitimacy of the state. The term squawman, once a mere descriptor, began to curdle into a slur, whispered with derision by the clean-shaven farmers and merchants who looked upon the mixed-race households with a mixture of pity and disgust. For the wealthy trader aspiring to become a judge, a territorial governor, or a town mayor, the presence of a wife in buckskin sitting on the porch of his frame house became an intolerable political obstacle. He began to see his spouse not through the eyes of the partner who had saved him from starvation in a blizzard, but through the critical, unyielding gaze of the Eastern missionary and the schoolmarm. The very skills that had made her a queen of the wilderness, her ability to butcher an elk, her knowledge of tanning chemicals, her comfort with silence and solitude, were now interpreted as markers of savagery, incompatible with the refined parlor culture the husband desperately wished to emulate. He watched with a growing sense of embarrassment as she refused to wear the constricting corsets and heavy petticoats of the white fashion, preferring the practical comfort of her traditional dress, a visual defiance that marked his household as uncivilized to every passing wagon. The social exclusion was immediate and brutal, manifesting in the way the new white women, fresh from Ohio or New York, pulled their skirts aside when passing the trader's wife in the muddy streets of the settlement. These newcomers, who had never skinned a rabbit or endured a mountain winter, looked down upon the indigenous women with a supreme arrogance, refusing to invite them to tea or acknowledge their presence at Sunday services. The native wife, who had once presided over the trading post feasts with the authority of a matriarch, found herself relegated to the shadows, pushed into the back rooms and the kitchens when respectable guests arrived. She was slowly erased from the public life of the husband she had helped to make rich, treated like a shameful secret rather than the foundational pillar of the family's success. The husband, driven by the hunger for social acceptance and the need to secure credit from Eastern banks, began to rewrite his own history, downplaying the indigenous support that had kept him alive. He stopped speaking the Shoshone or Arapaho dialects in public, languages he had once spoken with pride, and began to insist that his children speak only English, punishing them for using their mother's tongue. The psychological distance between the couple grew with every acre of land the husband fenced off, as he embraced the concept of private property and agrarian dominance that was alien to his wife's worldview. He began to view her not as the bridge to the local tribes, but as the anchor weighing him down, preventing him from rising to the upper echelons of the new territorial aristocracy that was forming around the courthouses and the churches. This betrayal was not merely a private domestic cooling, but a systemic rejection fueled by the racial ideologies gaining traction in the mid-19th century, which viewed the indigenous peoples as a dying race destined to vanish before the march of progress. The traitor, eager to be on the winning side of history, absorbed these poisonous narratives, convincing himself that his marriage was a youthful indiscretion, a temporary arrangement made in the wild that had no place in the civilized future. He began to resent the Indianness of his own household, the smell of smoked leather, the drying herbs, and the relatives who would visit and camp in the yard, seeing them all as stains on his reputation. The love and gratitude he might have once felt were suffocated by his ambition, replaced by a cold calculation of what it would cost to shed his past in order to secure his future. The tragedy was compounded by the fact that the wife often understood exactly what was happening, possessing a keen emotional intelligence honed by a lifetime of reading the intentions of others. She saw the way her husband's eyes lingered on the pale-skinned women stepping off the stagecoaches, noting the longing he felt for a partner who could read the Bible and host a dinner party according to the etiquette books. She realized that her competence in the wilderness, once her greatest dowry, was now irrelevant in a world where meat was bought at a butcher shop and clothes were ordered from a catalog. She was a master of a dying world, stranded in a new reality where her very existence was an embarrassment to the men she had served faithfully for a decade. By the late 1840s, the atmosphere in the trading posts had shifted from one of multicultural cooperation to one of segregation and impending betrayal. The trader spent more time in the nascent towns, courting the favor of the politicians and the bankers, leaving his indigenous family isolated on the homestead that was legally titled in his name alone. He was preparing the ground for a transition, convincing himself that he had a duty to his civilization that superseded his duty to his wife. The stage was set for the ultimate act of cruelty, where the economic partnership that had conquered the Rockies would be dissolved not by death or war, but by the arrival of a piece of paper and the ruthless desire for respectability. The turning point in this domestic tragedy usually arrived not with a whimper, but with the shrill, piercing whistle of a steamboat fighting the current of the Missouri River, or the rhythmic, grinding clatter of a stagecoach pulling into the dusty yard of the trading post. This mechanical intrusion signaled the physical arrival of the real bride, a white woman from a respectable family in Virginia, Ohio, or Kentucky, whom the trader had often courted exclusively through letters or during brief, sanitized trips back to the east. She stepped onto the muddy banks of the frontier dressed in the heavy, impractical fabrics of civilization, bombazine, silk, and lace, shielding her pale complexion with a parasol, a visual anomaly in a landscape defined by wind, sun, and grit. Her arrival was the final piece of the trader's transformation from a rugged mountain-man into a landed gentleman, but her presence required the immediate and ruthless erasure of the woman who had made his survival possible up to that very moment. The confrontation that followed inside the walls of the log home was rarely a scene of emotional negotiation or mutual understanding. Rather, it was a cold, transactional termination of employment that laid bare the brutal power dynamics of the era. The trader would enter the room where his native wife was working, perhaps grinding corn or nursing a child, and deliver the news with the detached authority of a master dismissing a servant who had outlived her usefulness. There was no discussion of their years together, no acknowledgement of the freezing nights she had kept him warm, or the times she had defended their property from theft. There was only the blunt statement that his true wife had arrived, and the house must be cleared of all evidence of his previous life before the sun dipped below the horizon. The intimacy of a decade was severed with a few sentences of English, a language the wife often understood imperfectly, though the tone of finality required no translation. To facilitate this displacement, the trader would offer a severance package that was insulting in its meagerness, a final slap in the face to the woman who had been his partner in everything but law. He would typically lead an old pack horse or a mule to the door, never one of his prime riding stallions, and toss a worn wool blanket over its back, perhaps adding a small sack of flour, a knife, and a few twists of tobacco as a parting gift. This collection of goods was not a settlement of assets, for she had no right to assets. It was a charitable donation to a displaced person, calculated to assuage the trader's own conscience rather than to provide for her future. He treated the mother of his children not as a spouse entitled to half of the estate she had helped build, but as a temporary laborer whose contract had expired, handing her the reins with a look that suggested she should be grateful for his generosity. The devastating reality for the indigenous wife was that she had absolutely no legal recourse to contest this eviction, as the marriage by the custom of the country that had bound them was entirely invisible to the expanding American legal system. In the eyes of the territorial courts and the federal government, she had never been a wife, she had merely been a concubine, a squatter living on the property of a white citizen without the sanction of the church or the state. She could not sue for divorce, she could not claim alimony, and she could not assert ownership over the trading post, the furs in the warehouse, or even the cooking pots at the hearth. The law viewed her as a non-entity, a biological fixture of the wilderness that had no standing in the civilized world, stripping her of the ability to fight for the home where she had birthed her children and buried her kin. As the native woman packed her few belongings, her beadwork, her sewing awl, and her medicine bag, she was forced to witness the immediate physical transformation of the space she was vacating. The trader, often in a panic to sanitize the environment before his white bride crossed the threshold, would order his men to remove the buffalo robes and the soft, smoked leather cushions, replacing them with stiff wooden chairs and imported rugs. The smell of sage and sweetgrass, the olfactory signatures of her culture, were aggressively aired out, to be replaced by the scents of lavender water and lye soap, the perfumes of the East. Her existence was being scrubbed from the floorboards and the walls, an active rewriting of history designed to protect the delicate sensibilities of the new mistress, who must never know the extent of the savagery that had preceded her tenure. The displacement was made even more bitter by the realization of who was taking her place, a woman who was visibly unsuited for the harsh realities of life on the edge of the map. The native wife, who could butcher a 1,000-pound elk in the field and navigate by the stars, watched as the new arrival shrank from the sight of mud and startled at the sound of a coyote. This real wife brought with her crates of porcelain dishes that would chip in the harsh winters, and delicate lace curtains that would gray in the dust of the plains, items that were useless for survival but essential for status. The trader was trading competence for optics, discarding a partner who could save his life for one who could only validate his social standing, a decision that underscored the deep racial and cultural self-loathing that drove the civilizing of the West. When the moment of departure finally came, it was often marked by a terrifying silence, a stoicism that the white observers mistook for indifference but which was, in reality, a mask of profound grief and dignity. The native woman would mount her horse, refusing to look back at the men who had betrayed her, and ride out of the gate of the fort she had helped to design. She was being exiled not just from her home, but from the life she had known, forced to return to a tribe that might no longer recognize her after years of living with the whites, or to drift to the fringes of the settlement as a beggar. She left behind the warmth of the hearth and the security of the walls, cast out into a world that had suddenly become hostile to her very existence, while behind her, the door was bolted shut to protect the virtue of a woman who had never known the labor of the frontier. The cruelty of this exchange was compounded by the trader's immediate psychological pivot. The moment she rode away, he ceased to think of her as a human being and began to regard her as a shameful chapter of his youth that must be buried. He would greet his new bride with a clean-shaven face and a lie on his lips, presenting himself as a bachelor pioneer who had conquered the wilderness alone. He would guide her through the rooms that still held the spiritual echo of the previous occupant, explaining away any lingering artifacts as curiosities of trade rather than evidence of a marriage. The erasure was total and deliberate, a willful amnesia that allowed him to play the role of the respectable patriarch while the woman who had sewn the clothes on his back rode alone into the gathering twilight. For the community of the trading post, the clerks, the laborers, and the other trappers, this scene was a familiar, uncomfortable ritual that signaled the end of the free, chaotic era of the fur trade. They watched the native woman leave with a mixture of guilt and relief, knowing that her departure meant the arrival of law and order, but also recognizing the fundamental injustice of the act. They knew that the porcelain teacups and the piano in the parlor were bought with the sweat of the woman on the horse, yet they said nothing, complicit in the great whitewashing of the frontier. The gate closed, the dogs barked, and the trading post turned its face toward the east, leaving the indigenous wife to vanish into the landscape she was no longer permitted to inhabit. However, the act of banishment, cruel as it was, paled in comparison to the absolute moral atrocity that followed regarding the division of the household's living assets, a category that the law and the father tragically expanded to include the children born of the union. In the twisted, pseudo-scientific logic of the mid-19th century frontier, these mixed-race sons and daughters were viewed through a fractured lens of racial salvage, where the white blood coursing through their veins was seen as a precious commodity that must be rescued from the savage influence of the womb that bore them. The traders, seeking to legitimize their lineage and secure heirs for their growing estates, frequently exercised their absolute patriarchal authority to claim sole custody of the children, forcibly severing the maternal bond with a brutality that treated the mother as nothing more than a biological vessel whose utility had expired the moment the child was weaned. This separation was justified by a pervasive, sanctimonious belief that the father was performing a moral duty, a rescue operation designed to strip the indigenous culture from the child's soul before it could take permanent root. The prevailing theory among the white settlers was that if a metis child could be isolated from the corrupting influence of the mother, dressed in starch and wool, and drilled in the strict tenets of the Christian faith, the Indian half of their nature could be effectively killed, leaving behind a useful, albeit second-class, member of civilized society. The father convinced himself that by tearing a weeping 5-year-old from his mother's arms, he was saving the child from a life of paganism and poverty, viewing the infliction of this profound emotional trauma as a necessary surgical procedure to excise the wildness from his own bloodline. The actual moment of separation was often a scene of chaotic violence that permanently stained the soil of the trading post courtyards, a raw display of power where legal rights were enforced by the barrel of a gun. When the mothers, driven by a primal instinct to protect their offspring, refused to relinquish their hold or attempted to flee with their children into the night, the veneer of the peaceful trader evaporated instantly. The guards of the factory, men who had perhaps once eaten food prepared by this very woman, would level their muskets at her chest, acting on the orders of a husband who now looked at her with the cold detachment of a stranger. The physical struggle was brief and one-sided. Women were dragged away kicking and screaming, their fingers pried loose from the clothing of their terrified children, who were then hustled indoors and locked away in the high-ceilinged rooms of the main house, effectively imprisoned in their own home. Once the gates of the fort slammed shut, the woman found herself standing alone on the vast, indifferent prairie, stripped of her role, her family, and her dignity, holding nothing but the empty air where her child had just been. This expulsion was a death sentence of the soul, for she was often condemned to a limbo between two worlds, unable to fully return to the life she had left behind a decade earlier. When these cast-off wives attempted to return to their ancestral tribes, they were frequently met not with open arms, but with suspicion and pity, or worse, with ostracization. To her people, she was a woman who had lived too long with the whites, who smelled of their soap and spoke their tongue, and who had returned without the children that constituted her status and her legacy. She was a ghost walking among the living, a reminder of the treacherous nature of the white man's promises. For those women who could not bear to return to the mountains in shame, or whose maternal tether was too strong to break, the trading post became the center of a harrowing, years-long vigil of grief. They would set up solitary, wretched camps in the shadow of the fort's walls, building lean-tos from scavenged branches and refusing to leave the vicinity of their stolen children. These women became fixtures of the frontier landscape, fort rats, in the cruel parlance of the soldiers, scavenging for scraps in the refuse piles and enduring the harsh winters in thin blankets, kept alive only by the desperate hope of catching a glimpse of a familiar face through a gap in the stockade fence. They haunted the periphery of the white man's world, silent specters of conscience that the trader tried to ignore as he looked out from his glass windows, seeing the mother of his children shivering in the mud while he sat by a roaring fire. Inside the house, the process of cultural erasure began with a ruthless efficiency, often overseen by the new white stepmother who viewed the mixed-race children as projects to be scrubbed clean and reformatted. The soft deerskin tunics and moccasins, sewn with love by the mother, were stripped off and burned, replaced by stiff, uncomfortable trousers and collars that restricted movement and symbolized the new constraints on the child's life. The long, dark hair, which in many tribes held spiritual significance, was shorn close to the scalp in the severe style of the Eastern schoolboy, a physical transformation intended to signal the death of the indigenous identity. The children were forbidden to speak their mother's language, punished with the rod for every slip of the tongue that betrayed their heritage, forcing them to bury their memories deep inside where the discipline could not reach. As the months turned into years, the mother waiting outside the gates would witness a slow, agonizing transformation during the rare moments she spotted her children playing in the post yard. She would see them growing taller, their skin paling as they spent more time indoors, their mannerisms stiffening into the formal posture of the white world. She would call out to them in their native tongue, a sound that once meant safety and love, but would see them look up with confusion or fear, the words becoming alien sounds to ears that were being retuned by English primers and hymnals. The tragedy was not just that they were separated by a wooden wall, but that a wall of silence and forgetting was being built in the child's mind, brick by brick, lesson by lesson, until the woman in the rags outside ceased to be mother and became merely a frightening, wild stranger on the edge of their vision. The physical toll of this vigil on the mothers was catastrophic, as they wasted away from a combination of malnutrition, exposure, and the crushing weight of a broken heart. Denied access to the commissary and unable to hunt effectively in the depleted environs of the fort, they relied on the charity of passing travelers or the scraps thrown to the dogs. Their bodies, once strong enough to process thousands of hides and carry heavy loads, became frail and bent, their beauty eroding under the wind and the sun until they became the haggard, invisible figures that the new settlers tried to avoid looking at. They were living monuments to the cruelty of the era, waiting for a reunion that the social order of the West had deemed impossible, slowly dying within shouting distance of the children they had birthed. The father, meanwhile, justified this slow execution of his former wife by pointing to the progress of his children, who were learning to read, to cipher, and to recite the Psalms. He convinced himself that the pitiful creature at the gate was no longer the woman he had married, but a relic of a savage past that had to be shed for the family to advance. He blinded himself to the reality that his prosperity was built on her labor and that his heirs were fed by the very skills she had taught him, choosing instead to believe the convenient narrative of the vanishing Indian. The ultimate horror was not the violence of the initial separation, but the long, quiet endurance of the aftermath, where a mother watched her children be stolen from her not by distance, but by the systematic annihilation of their memory of her love. The final and most devastating irony of this frontier saga arrived not with the violence of a raid, but with the silent, microscopic apocalypse that frequently trailed the wagons of the new civilization. By the late 1840s, the very connection to the Eastern world that the traders had coveted, the steamboats and the crowded stagecoaches, became the vector for their destruction. The sanitary cordons that the wilderness had naturally provided were broken, and with the imported lace and fine china came the invisible scourges of cholera, smallpox, and influenza. These pathogens, brewed in the filth of crowded eastern cities, found a terrifyingly fertile ground in the newly built, airless frame houses of the aspiring gentry. That civilized marriage, which was supposed to secure the trader's legacy and social standing, paradoxically became his death warrant, as the household lacked the biological resilience and the traditional knowledge required to weather the biological storm that was about to break over the valley. When the fever first struck the trading post during the harsh winter of 1847, the fragility of the new domestic arrangement was laid bare with a cruel precision. The white wife, often hailed as the epitome of delicate beauty and refinement, possessed an immune system that was completely unprepared for the virulence of the frontier strains of disease, compounded by a lifestyle that weakened her physical constitution. Unlike the indigenous women who had lived active, hardened lives outdoors, the new mistress of the house was often confined to the parlor, dressed in restrictive clothing and shielding herself from the fresh air that was deemed harmful by the medical ignorance of the era. She fell ill with a terrifying speed, her body collapsing under the assault of the virus, and the trader found that her knowledge of etiquette and piano playing offered no defense against the delirium that seized her mind and the pustules that ravaged her skin. The trader himself, despite his years of rugged survival, found that he was not immune to the catastrophe he had invited into his home. Having spent years living in the open air, his immune system had been bolstered by the rough diet and the constant exposure to the elements, but the sedentary lifestyle of the gentleman had softened him. More importantly, he had cut himself off from the only source of medical intervention that actually worked in these territories. In the past, when he had fallen ill with a fever or an infection, his native wife would have known exactly which willow bark to strip for pain, which roots to boil to break a fever, and how to construct a sweat lodge to purge the toxins from his blood. Now, stranded in his expensive bed with a dying wife, he was left with only the useless patent medicines imported from St. Louis, bottles of colored water and alcohol that did nothing to stop the lungs from filling with fluid or the skin from rotting. While the trading post was transformed into a pest house of moans and the stench of decay, a starkly different scene was playing out in the high timber of the surrounding mountains. The exiled indigenous wife, who had been cast out to die of exposure, was surviving through the very skills that her husband had deemed obsolete and embarrassing. Living in a solitary teepee or a brush shelter, she utilized the ancient strategy of isolation that her people had employed for centuries to combat the bad spirits of disease. She knew instinctively to move her camp away from the stagnant air of the valley, to drink only from the fast-flowing headwaters of the streams, and to rely on the stored pemmican and dried berries that she had prepared with her own hands. The harsh wind that rattled the windows of the trader's house was her ally, scouring her camp clean, while the deep snow acted as a barrier against the infection that was consuming the settlement below. The most tragic victims of this unfolding disaster were the mixed-race children who had been forcibly kept behind to be civilized by their father. Locked inside the infected house to prevent them from running away to their mother, they were trapped in a viral incubator with no escape and no comfort. These children, whose immune systems were a genetic battleground between two worlds, were often the first to succumb, their small bodies unable to withstand the viral load concentrated in the unventilated rooms. They died calling out for the mother who was only a few miles away, their cries unanswered by a father who was too weak to rise from his own deathbed. In some cases, the older children, driven by the terror of watching their guardians die, managed to break windows or pick locks, fleeing into the snow in a desperate attempt to find the parent who had been banished. However, these fugitives were often doomed by the very education that was supposed to save them, as they had been stripped of the survival instincts and the cultural knowledge necessary to navigate the wilderness. A boy who had spent the last 2 years in a classroom, dressed in wool trousers and leather shoes, did not know how to read the signs of a coming blizzard or how to start a fire with wet wood. They wandered into the white blindness of the prairie, seeking the warmth of a mother they could barely remember, only to freeze to death in the drifts, suspended literally and metaphorically between the white world that had rejected them and the red world they could no longer find. Their frozen bodies, found months later by the spring thaw, were the physical embodiment of the identity crisis that had been forced upon them, tragic monuments to a social experiment that had failed in the most lethal way possible. Inside the silent house, the final hours of the traitor were a torment of regret and clarity, as the fever burned away the pretensions of his social ambition. In his delirium, the expensive furniture and the lace curtains appeared not as symbols of success, but as the bars of a cage that he had built for himself. He realized too late that the savagery he had tried to purge from his life was actually the vitality that had sustained him, and that in trading his leather-clad wife for a silk-clad one, he had traded substance for shadow. He died in the dark, often lying next to the corpse of the woman he had brought from the east, surrounded by the material wealth that could not buy him a single drop of water or a moment of comfort, his legacy ending not in a dynasty, but in a room that neighbors were too afraid to enter for months. When the spring finally broke the grip of winter and the fear of infection subsided enough for the community to investigate, the scene they discovered was a grim tableau of the failure of the frontier dream. The house stood perfectly preserved, a mausoleum of Victorian aspiration, but inside, the rats and the cold had done their work. The bodies were often buried in mass graves or burned along with the house to prevent the spread of the sickness, erasing the physical evidence of the family that had tried so hard to be remembered. The traitor's name might later be carved onto a granite marker in the town cemetery, celebrating him as a pioneer and a founder of commerce, but the text would never mention the woman who had actually made his life possible, nor the children who had died trying to escape his ambition. Meanwhile, the indigenous wife, having survived the winter through her resilience and knowledge, would eventually descend from the mountains when the danger had passed. She would look upon the charred ruins of the trading post or the fresh mounds of earth in the cemetery with a stoic grief, knowing that her bloodline had been severed by the arrogance of a culture that believed it could conquer nature with paperwork and theology. She would return to her people or fade into the margins of the history books, a silent survivor who carried the truth of what had happened. She was the living proof that on the merciless frontier, survival was not granted to the most civilized, but to those who respected the land and understood that a fire built of buffalo chips warms the blood just as well as a coal stove, and that a wife bought with blankets was worth more than all the gold in St. Louis. History has largely chosen to remember the romance of the West through the lens of the white conquerors, erecting statues to the men who mapped the rivers and built the forts. But the true cost of that expansion lies in the unmarked graves of the indigenous women whose labor provided the calorie-for-calorie foundation of the fur trade, and whose bodies were discarded when that trade evolved. They were the biological and economic engine of the early frontier, the unsung heroines who converted the raw violence of the wild into the comfort of the home, only to be written out of the narrative when the story became too inconvenient for the national myth. The wind that blows through the abandoned foundations of those old trading posts carries their silence, a haunting reminder that the civilization of the West was built on the backs of women it refused to name, and that the price of forgetting is a history that is only half true.